yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and we are very happy to be here and present you today our report on electricity transmission and distribution tariff methodologies in Europe. Also from my side, good afternoon to everybody. First, today's presentation will give a short overview of the existing EU legal provisions and the respective role of the EU Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators. After, we will describe the process and the general principles of tariff setting. And finally, the presentation will go through the ACER findings on the national practices regarding various network tariff aspects, and also the ACER recommendations on how to improve them. First, we have to make an important statement that binding harmonization of the electricity network tariff structures is currently not foreseen by the EU law. This is a significant difference between the electricity and the gas sector, because in gas, in 2017, the Commission established a network code on harmonized transmission tariff structures. For a long time, this possibility of a network code was there also for the electricity transmission tariff structures, but with the 2019 recast of the electricity market regulation, this possibility was dropped. However, it does not mean that there are no binding EU provisions regarding electricity network tariffs. There are quite some. Among others, the EU law requires the network tariffs or the methodologies to be set or approved by the national regulatory authorities. It requires the network tariffs to be cost-reflective, transparent, non-discriminatory. The EU law requires that the network tariffs avoid net metering and account separately for electricity fed into the grid and the electricity consumed from the grid. The network tariffs shall avoid double charging of network users. The network charges shall neutrally support overall system efficiency through price signals to network users. And the network charges shall not include costs which are supporting unrelated policy objectives. And last but not least, I would like to highlight that regarding the charges for generators, actually there was some harmonization effort. Namely, the Commission regulation from 2010 required that the annual average transmission charges for generators do not exceed 0.5 euro per megawatt hour. There are some exceptions in the regulation where this ceiling was set higher. For example, in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, this G-charge ceiling is 1.2 euro per megawatt hour. In Romania, it's 2 euro per megawatt hour. And in Ireland, it's 2.5 euro per megawatt hour. It is also important to add that the ceiling is not applied for connection charges, neither for the charges for ancillary services and losses. This list is not exhaustive, but I tried to sketch some major features. So instead of the binding harmonization, the focus of the work on electricity network tariffs now has been shifted to increasing transparency and comparability in the tariff setting. Also, to identify and share the best practices. In this regard, the EU law assigned the duty to ACER to review the national tariff methodologies and issue a report on best practices at least every 2 years. The importance of this report is that the NRAs are required to take it into consideration when they are setting or approving network tariffs or their methodologies. The latest report we issued was in January 2023. It's available on our website. And we plan the next report to be published around end 2024, early 2025. Before going into the more substance, it is worth reminding that the network tariff setting is a 3-step process. So first, the allowed or target revenues of the network operators are determined. Then as a second step, the tariff structure is defined. And in the third step, the costs are allocated to each of the elements of the designed tariff structure. The ACER reports so far have been focusing on these last two steps. It is also very important to emphasize that by the term tariff in the ACER report and also in this presentation, we mean the regulated component of the final electricity bill, which is paid for the network services, so for the use of the network. Beyond this, there is also some other components of the final bill, like the energy costs component, including production costs. And there are also various taxes, levies, or surcharges, which are typically set by the governments. So again, when we talk about tariff, it's only the regulated component. Based on ACER's review, it appeared that when setting network tariffs, the tariff stability was a key objective for the NRAs so far. However, ACER also notes that the energy transition triggered several ongoing and planned changes in the tariff methodologies. In the EU, most NRAs set or approve the tariffs methodologies, for a fixed multi-year period. But there are also countries where the tariff methodology is revised every year or set for an indefinite period. Why I immediately apologized was that because the tariff values are usually set every year. Before setting the tariff methodology, it is usually, but not always, preceded by stakeholder consultations, either the entire public or at least some specific stakeholders. In ACER's view, this multi-year setting of the tariff methodologies, which is applied in most member states, is a good practice, and it has several benefits. It supports more substantial analysis of the design options for the NRAs. It provides more time for the system operators and the network users to adapt to the framework. It can also reduce uncertainties regarding investment decisions of the stakeholders. So ACER also recommended NRAs to set the tariff methodology for multiple years, actually at least for 4 years, which may be revised before the end of the period if needed, for example, in case of rapid changes in the sector. And regarding the network values, indeed updating them every year, or at least every year, is a good practice if it's done based on some predefined, ex-ante defined factors in the tariff methodology. Like this, you can increase cost reflectivity of the tariffs while you still manage to preserve a level of predictability. When the changes in the tariff design significantly impact the tariff values for individual grid users, we see that a multi-year transition process should be favored to mitigate those impacts. And regarding the involvement of the stakeholders, we find that systematic public consultations are the best tool to interact with them. It's transparent, it's inclusive, so they should be pursued. Tariff setting in general aims at recovering the costs incurred by the monopolistic system operator while stimulating efficiency and pursuing other objectives. So the cost recovery is the core objective. The efficiency mainly relates to cost reflectivity and to make sure that economic signals are sent to the network users for optimal use of the network. And the other tariff setting principles, which are usually pursued, include non-discrimination, transparency, non-distortion, simplicity, stability, predictability, and sustainability. In practice, it is very difficult to meet all these principles simultaneously and fully. And the NRAs therefore needs to find some balance between these principles and to make certain trade-offs, usually according to the principles in their national, according to the priorities in their national frameworks. When ACER started to review the national tariff methodologies, it immediately faced an important complexity, namely that the tariff structures and the categories of costs recovered by the elements significantly vary across the member states. This variety makes the comparison of the network tariffs in Europe a very difficult task. and it risks of being misleading. So in order to develop a common understanding when we are speaking about network tariffs, ACER identified a list of distinct tariff elements, such as costs of building, upgrading, maintaining infrastructure, the costs of recovering grid losses, the costs of system services, costs for metering. These are the so-called use of network charges, or sometimes they are also referred by the literature as access charges, which are typically paid based on a monthly basis. But in addition, there are also separate charges, like the one-off charges for connection to the grid, or the charges which follow the user's request for individual services, like reconnecting a network user if it was disconnected due to late payments, for example. ACER recommends the NRAs to apply the proposed tariff segmentation and identify for each of the elements or cost categories the most appropriate cost driver. This could be, for example, energy, which would be then €1 per megawatt hour charge. It could be the cost driver power, which is then results in €1 per megawatt charge, or it could be a fixed lump sum fee. And then this cost driver basically the basis of that tariff element. And it's very important that we set this basis right, because different costs show correlation with different cost drivers. So for example, the network development costs increase with the system peak, while the losses increase with the amount of injected and withdrawn energy. Therefore, the NRA's choice is very important because it has important implications on the overall system efficiency. In order to set the right basis, we recommend NRAs to obtain sufficiently granular data on network development and system operation, and also in order to allow that the network users can better understand their charges, compare them, adapt their behaviors to them, there should be an increase in transparency on these tariff elements and the corresponding costs. Now let's move to some more specific tariff aspects. First, the cost models, which are important element of cost reflectivity. I will show you why. The cost models determine the unit prices of the network tariffs. It can be done in multiple ways. In most member states, there is an average cost model, which means that you simply divide the allowed or target revenues for a year by the forecasted quantities, such as demand. And this is how you determine the unit prices of the network tariffs. But there are also other options, like the incremental or forward-looking cost models. These are applied only by a few countries in Europe. And these cost models determine the unit prices of the network tariffs by estimating the additional costs to increase the network capacity, and then you divide it by the increment of the cost driver. These cost models typically result in some residual costs, which require some further adjustments in order to ensure a full cost recovery. The preference for an average cost model is probably related to its advantages in terms of more straightforward cost recovery and less complexity in the calculations. However, the incremental and forward-looking cost models are more cost-reflective, and that's why they are favored by the economic theory. Just to illustrate this, one can think of the electricity network, one electricity network in one country, which has excess capacity. Now, in this case, it would be not efficient to signal to the end users a high tariff during peak periods, because it would unnecessarily lead to load shifting, which would affect the consumer's welfare and economic activity, while it would be unnecessary. With the average cost approach, it is likely to happen because the costs of the peak-related network investments from the past would be signaled to the network users. This would not happen in case of forward-looking or incremental cost models. So that's why there would be favored in terms of cost reflectivity. In light of the contrast between the economic theory and the practical aspects, ACER did not make a recommendation to NRAs on which cost models they should use, but ACER recommends the NRAs that within the next 4 years, based on resources, they evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of applying these incremental or forward-looking approaches and consult the results with the stakeholders. Another important element of cost reflectivity is cost cascading. The cost cascading traditionally refers to the allocation of some costs of a higher voltage level towards the lower voltage level, which means that some of the costs which incurs at higher voltage level would be paid by the network users who are connected at a lower voltage level, but not the other way around. This reflects well the traditional organization of the power sector, where the generation is almost exclusively connected at transmission level, but most of the consumption takes place at the distribution level. We see that the cost cascading applies in all member states except Malta, but it's specific because they don't have a transmission network. And it incurs in 3 forms. This you can see on the chart. So there is the cost cascading from transmission to distribution. There is the cost cascading from transmission, higher voltage level of transmission to lower voltage level of transmission. And then there is the third, where you cascade costs from higher distribution voltage level to lower distribution voltage level. And what we see is that in the member states, the transmission to distribution cost cascading is very frequent, also within distribution, but only a third of the countries apply cost cascading within transmission. And the reason for that is usually the lack of separation of the network charges, the lack of separation of the costs between different transmission voltage levels like high voltage or extra high voltage, or actually the network itself is not separated. Maybe there is no two network level within transmission. ACER also finds that about 90% of the transmission costs are cascaded downwards to the distribution level, which is broadly in line with the share of consumption at distribution level. There are 2 member states where this share is a bit lower, about 60%, but in these countries, the share of consumption at distribution level is also lower. So the correlation is also there. It should be flagged that not always all costs are cascaded, and not all network users are subject to cost cascading. When reviewing the national practices, we have seen that there are cases where the billing costs and metering costs are not cascaded. And there are also countries where the energy communities, for example, are exempted from cost cascading because they are only marginally required using other network levels, or at least the NRA deems so. Now there is an interesting case with the energy transition, and this is the inverted power flows. So when the direction of the flow would change from lower voltage level to higher voltage level, and if they become more dominant, for example, due to the penetration of vast distributed generation, then it can challenge the idea of the top-down cost cascading. And it would imply that some form of reverse cost cascading may be necessary. However, nobody applies it so far, to our knowledge, and only 2 member states reported that they consider it for the future. The others, they claim that inverted power flows are not a frequent phenomenon in their system, or they argue that there is no evidence of benefits for higher voltage level users coming from investments in lower voltage levels. So what ACER recommends regarding cost cascading? Well, ACER agrees to the importance of cost cascading for cost reflectivity and stresses that network users should contribute to the costs of each network level used by them. And for this, ACER recommends NRAs to collect sufficiently granular data on the network costs and the flows, regularly check the economic rationale behind cost cascading, and also ensure that there is transparency and there is proper justification behind the decision, which form of cost cascadings and in which directions are applied. Now let's move to another topic, how you split the network costs. Well, the network costs related to the use of the network may be charged to injection and or to withdrawal. ACER finds that in the European Union, the recovery of the network costs heavily based on withdrawal charges, and the injection generators pay only a small share of it, with a few exceptions, like you see on the chart, Sweden, Ireland, and Finland, where this share is higher. The chart only shows the split for the transmission costs, but for distribution, the share of the generation would be even lower. It would be up to a few percentages. This low share, as we already discussed, is not purely a national decision, because the EU law itself put a cap on the average value of the transmission charges for the generators. How NRAs make this split, it actually varies across the member states. Some member states set the injection charge first, and then the remaining costs are allocated to withdrawal. In some countries, the NRA decides on a fixed percentage for a particular cost category. And then there are also the countries who try to identify the costs directly related to injection, and those costs which are related to withdrawal, of course, for sake of cost reflectivity. So let's look first at the withdrawal charges. The withdrawal charges are applied in all EU member states, and in most member states, they have a combined tariff basis, which is typically an energy-based component together with a power-based component and or a lump sum component. But there are also some countries where there is only energy-based charge, and very few countries where there are only power-based charges. The energy-based charges tend to have a higher weight in the cost recovery, still, in particular in distribution, but ACER noted a gradual move to increasingly power-based network tariffs. ACER considers that this move is appropriate because bulk of the costs are infrastructure-related, network development-related costs, which show correlation with the contracted or peak capacity. We also see that the withdrawal charges are not, let's say, flat charges. They typically vary based on voltage level and the time of use. But on the contrary, the locational signals are very rare. They are applied only in a few countries, Austria, Sweden, and if we go outside the EU, Norway in Europe, who were subject of our ACER report. If we do not account for differences because of the different DSO areas, of course. So that's maybe an interesting piece of information. Now let's move to the injection charges. Here ACER finds that about half of the member states apply injection charges. Where they typically apply for both transmission and distribution. And where no injection charges apply, producers may still be subject to some relevant network costs. For example, in several member states, the producers pay deep connection charges. So basically, some of the network reinforcement costs are already in their charges. In other countries, they may pay in kind for losses. And there are also countries where they have to provide system services for free. What we see is that there is also difference with regard to which costs are covered via injection charges. In some countries, they recover via injection charges grid losses and system services. This is slightly more frequent. Or they, in other countries, recover the network development costs. We also see that there are countries where there is no such differentiation. So basically, the generation covers part of the overall network costs, including all cost categories. We also see that the basis of the injection charges tend to correspond to the cost drivers, which means that in most cases, the energy-based charges are used for the recovery of the cost of losses and system services, and the power-based charges slightly more frequent for the recovery of infrastructure costs. In some member states, injection charges are differentiated between voltage levels, and in some member states also based on location. They are very similar to the ones I mentioned for withdrawal charges. And ACER notes that regarding injection charges, it's the time of use signals which are missing. ACER notes that not the same injection charges are applied to all producers, or sometimes some producers are exempted. There are different treatments in some countries, for example, based on the size of the producer, the technology. For example, renewables are preferentially treated, or those generators who provide ancillary services, they are treated differently. And as one last finding, Germany is the only country where they apply only a negative injection charge. This negative injection charge is an interesting one. So it is paid to the non-intermittent decentralized generators for their system beneficial impact, because some electricity withdrawal from higher voltage levels can be avoided thanks to the injection by the decentralized generators at lower voltage levels. The avoided network charges are paid to these decentralized generators. We also saw that in Sweden they also apply some rewards if some reduction in the losses are pointed out, but they already apply injection charges. That's why I singled out the German case. It seems clear that the increasing interconnection and integration in EU electricity markets implies an increasing risk that the injection charges, if they are not cost reflective, they can distort competition and investment decision. So ACER stresses the importance to set the injection charges in a cost reflective way. And in this regard, we also provide some recommendations. First, ACER recommends NRAs not to use energy-based injection charges to recover infrastructure costs. Instead, they should use cost-reflective power-based or lump sum charges. At the same time, energy-based charges can provide efficient signals for losses and system services. And there are also costs which do not show correlation with neither capacity nor energy, but rather with the number of network users or meters. In principle, these charges should be covered by lump sum charges. These costs should be covered by lump sum charges. Second, in order to avoid discrimination across the network users connected to different network levels and not to provide them a wrong incentive where to connect to the grid, it's important that the injection charges are consistently defined in the transmission and the distribution tariff methodologies. And third, when setting the injection charges, we request NRAs to consider all network-related cost burdens on the concerned network users to avoid any double charging. So meaning that the same cost is not recovered twice, right? And maybe just one final point, which we also find important, that because of the impacts, potential cross-border impacts coming from injection charges, NRAs should consult at least the NRAs of the neighboring countries in advance when they make a substantial change regarding this topic. Due to their bidirectional network use, it is advisable to highlight separately in this presentation the treatment of the storage facilities and the prosumers. We find that in the countries where they apply injection charges, the prosumers and the storages typically pay both injection charges and withdrawal charges. It's also true that in many countries there are discounts and preferential treatments to both. And we also see that in some countries there are differences between these two groups of network users. For example, in some member states, the storage facilities are fully exempted from network charges, which is not the case for prosumers. The different treatment of the storage facilities and the prosumers may be justified by the different cost impacts they trigger to the network, but this topic would require a bit more investigation also from our side. Here in our latest report, we limited ourselves to provide the basic rule, which is that in order to avoid distortions, the costs caused by network users should be reflected in the tariffs. So, if a network user only withdraws from the grid or only injects into the grid, in principle, only the cost relevant for the withdrawal or the cost relevant for the injection should be attributed to this network user. Unlike if a network user both withdraws from the grid and injects into the grid, so both network uses are there, then both should be considered when setting the tariffs, of course, by properly taking into account the potential cost offsetting effects. So at the end, what you want to charge them is for their overall cost impact to the network. In this regard, it's important to underline that the fact that a network user pays a charge for injection or a network user pay another charge for withdrawal is not an unjustified double charging per se. We have to see the impacts. For example, for grid losses, they incur in both when there is injection or withdrawal. And similarly, if you apply only injection charges or only withdrawal charges or both, and you use the very same charges which you would apply for producers and consumers, this does not necessarily ensure non-discrimination. So again, you have to consider the cost impacts. In recent years, the emerging network users like Power-to-X facilities, EV charging points, energy communities, they have gained attention for their potential to improve overall system efficiency. And ACER carried out a first review of the tariff treatment of these network users. And we noted that in some countries, they have some special treatment, either to facilitate their penetration or due to specific cost impacts. For sake of time, I would just mention that, for example, public EV charging points in some countries pay energy-based charges instead of power-based charges, and energy communities, as it was mentioned before, in some countries are exempted from costs which incur at higher voltage levels because it's not used by them. Now let's move to another tariff design aspect, which is the application of the time of use signals. Why they are important? Well, the costs are typically vary depending on when the network is used, and this variation can be reflected in the network tariffs. So in this way, we can provide further economic signals. We see that the time of use tariffs are widely used in the EU, as shown on the chart, mainly for distribution, but also in about a third of the countries, also for transmission. And they gain even higher importance than in the past due to the more active customers, the more controllable devices, the more sophisticated meters. We see that they can be a useful tool for reducing the network peak load, And we also pointed out that there have also important limitations. For example, not all users may be capable to react to such signals to the same extent, or the signal may be weak if the difference in the charges is too low, or the network charge component has a low weight in the final electricity bill. It can also diminish its impact. When we looked at the national practices, we have seen that the time of use tariffs are static and vary within the day by defining certain blocks of hours during which there is a higher or lower unit price which is charged for the use of the network. And there are also countries where they distinguish between weekdays and weekends, and also there are countries where they differentiate between seasons like summer and winter. It's important that there is a more advanced differentiation of the costs based on time and location. Therefore, more cost reflectivity could be brought into the tariff design by using dynamic tariffs. But this is rather complex and requires a sufficient level of automation. And they may also contradict some other principles like simplicity and predictability. We have seen that only very few countries apply some market-based elements or dynamic tariffs in the network charging. There are also complements to time of use network tariffs, but for sake of time, I would not go into them in details. Maybe just mention one. There could be local markets for system operation services, which could also mitigate local congestion and avoid network expansion. Regarding the time of use, ACER also made several recommendations. One of them was that where there is no time of use signal applied, the NRAs should investigate the need for them from a cost efficiency and network congestion point of view. When they apply these time of use signals, NRAs should regularly evaluate their appropriateness. They may require some adjustments. In order to have a proper design, the data collection and analysis, again, should be improved. We mentioned that there may be countries where the time of use is missing due to lack of proper meters. In this case, as a temporary solution, NRAs may still design network tariffs by determining for different user profiles their contribution to the system peak. And just one final thing here, that if the need is confirmed for the time of use tariffs, then it should be mandatory for all network users without the possibility to opt out. Optionality may be temporarily reasonable when there is a transition. If you're interested, during the Q&A session, we can go into some more details. But before concluding, there are two more charges which I wanted to quickly flag upon very briefly. One is the reactive energy charges. Here we see that in several member states, the costs related to controlling the network voltages and managing the reactive power increased over the last years, mainly due to reduced availability of traditional thermal generation capabilities, and it increased the relevance for applying reactive energy charges. We recommend the NRAs to monitor the evolution of these costs, and where these costs are deemed significant, the NRAs should consider a review of the reactive energy charging and make sure that they support system efficiency through the signals to the network users. In the ACER report, we collected information on the applied thresholds and values for the reactive energy charging across Europe, and we recommend NRAs to take these values into account when they considering and evaluating possible adaptations. And finally, on connection charges, as it was mentioned, they are typically one-off charges covering the costs of connecting a new network user to the network. They may be shallow or deep, depending on whether a network user pays only for its own direct connection costs or beyond that also pays for network reinforcement. In about half of the countries, both shallow and deep charges are applied. In the other half, either one or the other. The reasons for application of deep connection charges is usually to provide some locational signals and increase cost reflectivity. And for shallow charges is usually the simplicity which is favored by the NRAs, and also more visible and certain for the network users. Maybe here I want to also mention that the connection charges, if they are well designed, indeed they can provide incentives to network users to connect at points of the network which are most cost efficient, meaning the deep connection charges primarily. But it has to be added that they may play a small role, these charges, in the decision of choosing a location for a new production or load, because there are several other factors like the availability of natural resources, permitting, taxes, logistics, and so on. The recommendations which we have is either related to the cost sharing between current and future network users in case of deep connection charges, where the charge would be levied on one network user, but it may benefit future network users. And also we ask NRAs to evaluate advantages and disadvantages of enabling interruptible or flexible connection agreement, which they seemed from our report that not yet widely applied. So before finishing, just a few takeaways to summarize. Network tariffs have the core objective to recover the costs incurred by the network operators. Finding the balance in the tariff setting principles is a complex task. It involves trade-offs. The tariffs can be designed in multiple ways. One size fits all may not work. NRAs follow different approaches. There is no binding harmonization, but we were assigned to share best practices. So to fulfill this duty, ACER tried to identify shortcomings in the tariff practices and make recommendations to NRAs. This work is ongoing and we will continue. Thank you very much for your attention.